Welcome to the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Megan Garrison. On today's episode, we have Squabbles of the American West, stories of Mormons and land rights, fights for freedom, military miscommunication, and their impacts on the American West in the late 1850s. It is time to talk about some squabbles that occurred in the American West in the 1850s. My name is Megan, and in this episode, Chloe, Ben, and I will be talking about some of the wars that happened during this time period. I know you can't see me, but I used air quotes around wars, because, well, these aren't what you might think of when you think of a war, and you'll soon see why. The first event in the episode is known as the Border War, or Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is essentially a precursor for the Civil War, which was responsible for some of the bloodiest and deadliest battles in United States history. The war was caused over slavery, which also caused Bleeding Kansas. Alright, so I'll first discuss what was Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, also known as the Border War, was a series of very violent civil confrontations in the Kansas Territory between 1854 and 1859. Why were these confrontations occurring, you might be wondering? Well, it all began in 1854 when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would allow Nebraska and Kansas territories to choose whether or not to allow slavery when they joined the Union. This was known as popular sovereignty because the citizens of the territory got to vote because Kansas was on the border of Missouri, which was a slave state at the time. Kansas then became basically a battleground for the people who were pro-slavery and the people that were anti-slavery. Oh, and why wasn't Nebraska affected this way? Well, Nebraska was farther north. They were assumed to be anti-slavery, so that left the Kansas Territory to suffer the consequences of this act. After this act was passed, things heated up in the Kansas Territory. All hell was about to break loose. In March of 1855, the first legislative elections took place. Both pro- and anti-slavery sides sent voters, many from outside the territory. The North sent voters to ensure the state would be free, but the South, especially Missouri, sent their pro-slavery voters who used intimidation and illegal voting to try and scare off all of the other voters. Well, the president at the time, President Pierce, decided that having a pro-slavery legislation would be the only legitimate form of government in the new Kansas Territory. And, yes, you can already guess, it's going to get even worse. This decision just made the anti-slavery voters even more angry. They even had their own political rallying song. Said the lyrics, "Far in the west rolls the thunder, the tumult of battle is raging. Where bleeding Kansas is raging, warfare with slavery. Struggling with foes who surround her, lo, she implores you to stay her. Will you to slavery betray her? Never. She shall be free. Hurrah. Swear that you'll never betray her. Kansas shall be free." This was printed in the New York Daily newspaper in March of 1856. By early 1856, the violent outbreaks were starting, and things for everybody were just getting worse. The first big event, the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, started in May of 1856. Now, you may have heard of a man named John Brown. John Brown is often remembered for his raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859, but he was also involved with the violence that resulted from the sacking of Lawrence. A group of pro-slavery Southerners marched into the free area of Lawrence, where they looted and destroyed property, and they even lit a hotel on fire. People all over the North were appalled, and newspapers were filled with the stories of this event, calling it a stab to their freedom. This blow to the anti-slavery stronghold caused anti-slavery supporters like John Brown to retaliate. Brown was an abolitionist, a person against slavery, who was very involved in the Kansas Territory. He was fed up with pro-slavery raiders coming through and causing chaos. So, he took the matters into his own hands. 3 days after the sacking, Brown gathered 4 of his sons and 3 other men to confront the pro-slavery groups. Well, when they got to the Potawatomi Valley, where these people had resided, Brown, his sons, and 3 other men dragged 3 pro-slavery raid members out of their homes and murdered them. And if I may add, they murdered them brutally. John Brown didn't stop there. He just kept on going. Talk about a dedication to what you believe. In July of 1856, more pro-slavery forces showed up to shut down a meeting that was being held in Topeka about free state rights. As you might guess, this got ugly. John Brown retaliated once again. He, along with a group of other abolitionists who were his supporters, led 2 other large, violent attacks. What is so interesting about this is that a large majority of the people who resided in the Kansas Territory weren't really that invested in the conflict over slavery. Poor farmers in the area who were categorized as pro-slavery often just wanted to feed their families and didn't actually even own slaves. Other people who were labeled anti-slavery weren't even doing anything to help the people of color or advocate for their rights at all. The violence was just mainly between the two radical sides on the spectrum of the issues in Kansas. In 1857, there was a constitutional convention in Lecompton, Kansas, to propose the Lecompton Constitution, which was a pro-slavery document deeming that the Kansas Territory would be a slave state. Free staters, as they were called, boycotted the event, as they were upset that many fraudulent votes had been cast for this constitution. Well, the president at the time, President Buchanan, was going to have Congress push to pass the Constitution, but there was a disagreement by the people in Congress, such as Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. Because nobody was getting anywhere and disagreements kept happening, they decided to push the votes one more time for the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas in 1858. This time, the Free Staters decided to vote, and guess what happened? The Constitution was rejected, but there was still more to come. This isn't the end of the story. The Lecompton Constitution was rejected, but violence waged on. There were more violent attacks in 1858 and 1859 by Free Staters and the people who were pro-slavery. Then, in 1859, the man of the hour, John Brown, led a raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the purpose of liberating a group of enslaved people. In the end, the raid failed. Brown was executed, which made him a martyr to the cause of freeing the slaves. There were still issues with the Kansas state constitutions in Congress. Things also were heated in the Illinois Senate race. Abraham Lincoln spent this race trying to take Senator Douglas's seat. Though unsuccessful, Lincoln would go on to win a series of debates with Douglas over the issue of slavery. This revived his political career, getting him a presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 1860. The debate between pro-slavery and the anti-slavery groups in Kansas would remain an issue until Kansas joined the Union in 1861. If you think the issue is over, it's definitely not. The Civil War would begin a few months later. Now, I will hand it over to Chloe to talk about another war in the American West, the Utah War.
Thank you, Megan, for the awesome introduction and your insightful overview of Bleeding Kansas and its impacts. Welcome, listeners. I'm Chloe. Today, I'm going to tell you about an event that occurred around the same time as Bleeding Kansas, the Utah War. It's also referred to as the Utah Expedition, Utah Campaign, Buchanan's Blunder, or the Mormon War. Why there are so many names to such a short event? I'd tell you if I knew. We begin our story in 1857. Bleeding Kansas is ongoing. The Mexican War had ended 7 years earlier, and the Civil War is still in the dim future. Though the Utah War was insanely short, it still generated so much national attention and still provides rich insight on the tensions between religious organizations and the U.S. government, which seems to be a reoccurring theme in American relational struggles. This historical event begins with the Mormon community's persecution in the East for their beliefs and practices. This drove them to migrate to the West and settle in Utah, where the war takes place. The Mormons had many goals and motivations that drove them to create the strong community that they were, and often still are today. Part of the Compromise of 1850, Senator Henry Clay introduced the Utah Territorial Bill, which established a territorial government. So Utah was a territory by September 9, 1850, migrated there. The Mormon community quickly grew. They were a hardworking group and extremely close-knit, frequently helping their neighbors whether or not they were members of the congregation. Mormon leader Brigham Young was appointed as the first territorial governor. He had worked closely with Joseph Smith, who was the original founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, established in 1830. He became the second president of the Latter-day Saint Church. Brigham Young was greatly responsible for shaping the American West. He led the Latter-day Saints to Utah and was popularly known as the Mormon Moses or American Moses, and the people revered him as a prophet. He was a serious-looking man with dark shoulder-length hair that he often wore brushed back and neat. As governor, he created multiple programs to construct, including roads, bridges, forts, irrigation ditches, public welfare programs, and more. He served a major role in establishing settlements in Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, northern Mexico, and of course Utah. It is often noted that Brigham Young had a gift for speech and could light a fire in people with his words and his passion. His vision was responsible for the building of more temples than any other Mormon leader in that community. Everyone was living happily. until the community began to draw government's attention. You see, there were certain Mormon values and traditions that were not necessarily aligned with the ideology that America was striving to establish as a new country of power and integrity. The Mormon religion at that time had ties to things such as polygamy and slavery, which some politicians in the U.S. saw as, quote, twin relics of barbarianism. So when President James Buchanan was inaugurated on March 4, 1857, he moved rather quickly to control this growing force. Buchanan wanted to replace Young with an outsider, someone who was not a member of the church. This may not seem like a big enough deal to start a war over, but we have to keep in mind the tight-knit connections of this community and the history of the persecution they suffered. The Mormon religion makes it a point to be set apart from people who aren't members. Their temples, for example, are not open to general public, except for cases of open houses and rededication ceremonies. But the U.S. government wanted someone on their side who would work with them to grow America in their vision. Alfred Cumming was appointed to take Young's place. Cumming was from a distinguished family and was widely experienced in Western political and business affairs. He was a larger man with short white hair and no desire for violence. His goal was to occupy his position with dignity and fairness. The Mormon community saw the integration of a new governor as an immediate threat, as territorial governors were appointed by the president. They assumed that this was an act of persecution. In the government's eyes, it was an attempt to bring the Mormons into a more conventional relationship with the nation. At a time when national and territorial tensions were high and conflict over slavery were becoming an issue of states' rights versus centralized national authority. Buchanan's choice ultimately created bitterness and misunderstanding. Once the Mormons caught wind that the Utah Territory's new governor was traveling under militia escort, they assumed the worst. Young rallied their militia, known as the Nauvoo Legion, and the community made preparations for defense. It's crazy to think about this today, and what a phone call could have prevented during this time. This event largely happened because of a big miscommunication between two powers. Neither wanted this war. The fear of an uprising and the fear of persecution were so high that everyone felt threatened. For a whole year, tensions remained. The Nauvoo Legion had some cunning tactics. Instead of fighting head-on, which would ultimately result in a massacre with unnecessary bloodshed on the Mormon side, the Legion decided to try and weaken the U.S. military instead. I'm sure that they probably knew that against the militia they had little chance of victory, and even if they had one, what then? I don't know the minds of those involved, but I can assume their main goal was not to run a country or deal with those affairs. The Legion felled trees in the U.S. military's path, stampeded animals, and even stole or destroyed their food rations. In a journal entry, a man named Tracy, a soldier in Johnson's army, who was on that journey to Utah, actually mentioned the lack of food and clothing the soldiers had at their position because of the Legion's tactics. Tracy noted that their winter rations were running low because of the raids that had occurred. Quote, "The odor of old soup in the company kettles, made up, as it is, from the perfectly black and rotted beef of our November slaughter, and with no sign of seasoning, compelled me absolutely to turn aside my head." Now, we call this historical event a war, but in all honesty, there was never an actual battle between the U.S. military and the Mormons' militia. However, that doesn't mean that there was no bloodshed. On September 11, 1857, members of the Mormon community, most likely those from the Legion, were held on suspicion for a mass murder of Western migrants. Roughly 120 Californian-bound settlers, unarmed men, women, and children, were traveling together. They are from states like Arkansas and Missouri. They were killed in southwest Utah by a group of Utah Mormons. The full details of this brutal attack, known as the Mountain Meadow Massacre, are still unknown. When confronted about it, the Mormon community initially claimed that the migrants must have been killed by natives, but investigations proved otherwise. There was another incident about a month after Mountain Meadow, on October in 1857, referred to as the Aiken Massacre. The Mormon militia arrested 6 Californians, once again travelers going through Utah. They charged them with being spies for the U.S. Army. The travelers were released, with obviously no evidence to keep them. However, soon after being released, these same individuals were murdered and robbed of their stock and $25,000. This mass murder cannot be directly connected to the Mormon militia, yet speculations were made accusing the Mormon militia of this massacre because of the previous one. Not much happened to those who committed the murders, except for John D. Lee, who was the leader of the local Mormon community and the local militia. He went on trial twice. Lee was convicted by a jury, sentenced to death, and executed in Utah by a firing squad on March 23, 1877. It's estimated that roughly 150 people died as a direct result of this war, which is actually very similar to the mortality rate of the 7-year-long struggle in Kansas that Megan described for us. There have been several remembrances of Mountain Meadow Massacre, including commemorative observations, the building of monuments and markers, and the creation of associations to help promote the massacre's history and ensure protection of the massacre site and grave sites. The first of these was founded in 1859 by Major James H. Carleton of the U.S. Army and his cavalry. They arrived with orders to bury the bones of the massacre victims, but while there, they decided to make a structure of loose granite and stone to form a mound as a memorial for those who had died there. It was 15 feet in circumference at the base, 12 feet in height, and supported a cross made from red cedar wood. On the cross, facing towards the north, was an inscription carved in the wood saying, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." And on a slab of granite was written, "Here 120 men, women, and children were massacred in cold blood early in September 1857. They are from Arkansas." Allegedly, a few years later, in 1861, during a tour of southern Utah, Brigham Young, along with some 60 other saints, visited the massacre site. After viewing the inscription on the cross, Wilford Woodruff, who was another religious leader of the LDS and soon to be fourth president of that church, recorded that President Young had stated, "It should be vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little." The cross was then torn down, and the rocks of the mount were dismantled, leaving little of the original marker. Tensions eventually began to die down, thanks to Cummings' eagerness to make peace. The government and Mormon community attempted to find common ground to stop this expensive and unnecessary conflict. The transfer of Utah's governorship from Church Brigham Young to non-Mormon member Alfred Cumming was finally confidently in motion. With such rebellion came consequences for Utah. The U.S. military planned to keep a presence in that area, but that was as short-lived as the war was. The Civil War began in the East, and troops were called to fight and prepare for what historical events were to come next. And that, my friends, is the experience of the Utah War. Now it's time to hear about our next Squabble of the West from our friend Ben.
Hey, I'm Ben Birdsell. I'm a secondary education history major, and my story also relates to Chloe's themes of government and military miscommunication and how they almost led to a national conflict. My conflict is often forgotten about and stands in the shadow of the American Civil War. My conflict is the Pig War. This conflict tells the story of two countries fighting over insignificant land, and the fun part of this conflict is that it started over the shooting of a single Berkshire pig all the way back in 1859. So for the next little while, I'm going to tell you about how the events of the Pig War of 1859 showed the extremes of manifest destiny, a series of conflicting egos, the prevailing of cooler heads, and ultimately, the power that one pig can hold in the hearts of many. To tell the story of the Pig War, we have to start all the way back with the Revolutionary War and its outcome. After the Americans won, USA, there was an agreement to expand the American colonies west to share the border with the French territory, which later on became the Louisiana Purchase. But one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, made a push to claim more northern parts of Canada. At the time, what we know today as Canada was actually known as British North America, but to make it easier for my understanding and yours, I'll just call it Canada. During these negotiations, Great Britain ended up hating the idea as most of their Canadian territory was already well established. The UK then rejected the idea, and with Canada off the table, there needed to be an agreement as to where the northern border of the new United States ended and where the Canadian border began. For the most part, there's plenty of agreements with rivers, lakes, and certain parallels, but west of the Great Lakes, there weren't many great contenders for where the border should have been drawn. The issue was, at this time, there wasn't great cartography west of the former colonies, and the border they agreed upon was geographically awful. For the most part, It was mostly built on general guesses of the area and was a compilation of local sources that proved to be unreliable. They ended up using the John Mitchell map, and to sum it up, the map said there was a nice oval lake, and directly west of it, they could draw a line along a parallel until it met the Mississippi River. The two sides agreed on this arbitrary and inaccurate line and called it a day. There was a major issue, though, and it was that the lake wasn't oval-shaped in any capacity, and the Mississippi River was well over a couple hundred miles south of where they thought it was. So the map ended up being nearly useless when decades later it was updated, and the lake and the Mississippi River were several hundred miles apart. Not knowing this at the time, the two countries agreed to draw a straight line left of the small lake and over to the Mississippi River, and Great Britain and America lived happily ever after, and the border was finalized. Then the War of 1812 took place, and with the conclusion of the war largely being a tie where there was no clear winner, the issue of the U.S.-Canadian border was still left to be worked out. After much deliberation, they settled on the 49th parallel, which is still the border today, but this only extended through the recently acquired Louisiana Purchase and to the eastern edge of the Oregon Territory within the Rocky Mountains. The issue with the Oregon Territory was that both Britain and the Americans claimed the Oregon Territory as their own. Both countries wanted the trade, resources, and power that would come along with owning the Columbia River. The main argument was at the time that America wanted as much land as they could and tried to force the 49th parallel to get land on both sides of the Columbia River. But Britain wanted to draw the border along the Columbia River itself. The main reason for the British the British put their foot down was because the massive fur trade industry that was being ran in the Oregon Territory. But to maintain peace, both sides decided that joint civilian occupation would be best. So, for a while, that took place. But that didn't guarantee both sides would agree with each other in the Oregon Territory. This peace lasted a good couple of decades until the 11th president of the U.S., James Polk, was elected in 1845. Polk himself was an extremist for Manifest Destiny and for pushing our border even further west, and the co-occupation of the Oregon Territory made him upset like a little baby who wasn't getting the candy he wanted. At this point, Britain wanted the U.S.-Canada border to be the Columbia River, once was underneath the already agreed upon 49th parallel, but Polk wanted to be the 49th parallel absolutely, where we would gain a large part of modern-day Washington and Oregon. Polk threatened war by pulling out of the occupation agreement, but in the end, both sides didn't want to go to war because Britain liked the trade between them, and America got into war Both sides didn't want to go to war because Britain liked the trade between them, and America got into war shortly thereafter with Mexico in the Mexican-American War. But in the end, Britain's hand was forced, and in 1846, a treaty was signed confirming the 49th parallel as the border between America and Canada. Okay. Here's where the Pig War finally begins. The treaty was all in good until it reached the San Juan Islands, which are northwest of Seattle and directly east of Vancouver, British Columbia, in modern-day terms. The issue with the treaty was its verbiage. The treaty says that, and I quote, "The said 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver's island, and thence southerly through its middle of the said channel, and of Fuca's Straits to the Pacific Ocean." Here, I'd like you to either look up a map of the Pig War or just an image of the San Juan Islands. I'm going to give you a second here. If you don't have the chance to look up an image of the Pig War or San Juan Islands, just imagine a random scatter plot or cluster of islands with no clear passages except for directly down the middle, to the far left, or to the far right. That would give each country total control over the islands. Okay. So where's this middle channel? There isn't one. This led to huge disputes on both sides, with both sides claiming different channels, either fully east or fully west, to claim the entirety of the San Juan Islands to either the British or the Americans. This held the islands in dispute and contention, which would have led to another great war between both the Americans and the British. But at the time, this discrepancy in a treaty for a rather small set of islands was not high on either the Americans or the Brits' to-do list, but had great impact on the local settlers in the area. The island of San Juan was eventually settled for its agricultural resources, and a massive British sheep farm was placed on the island with a handful of Berkshire pigs, which will be very important later on in the story. These sheep were owned by Charles Griffin, one of the largest landowners on San Juan Island. Right around this time, Lyman Cutler also settled on San Juan Island after a gold rush caused an influx of Americans to go on the Oregon Trail and up to modern-day Puget Sound. Anyways, Lyman Cutler was, quite frankly, the smartest man to ever live. He had settled down on San Juan Island and planted a potato crop. The issue was that it had a 3-sided fence. So just imagine a three-sided fence for a second. You have a cube, and you take off one side. Anyways, with this three-sided fence, one of Charles Griffin's Berkshire pigs wandered over to the wide-open potato patch and ate some of Lyman's potatoes. Here is the shot heard around the world in the story of the pig war. Lyman saw the pig eating his potatoes and shot Griffin's pig. After the fact, Lyman felt quite guilty for it and knew Griffin personally, so Lyman walked on over to Griffin's house and attempted to apologize. With already raised tensions between the conflicting beliefs of British and American occupation, Griffin demanded $100 for the pig. $1,859 to keep in mind, which is about $3,500 for a single pig. Lyman, of course, refused to pay so much money for a single pig, and afterward, Griffin grabbed some police officers and confronted Lyman and attempted to arrest him. Here is where the fundamental issue of the pig war took place. At this point, British officials were attempting to arrest an American man who believed that he was on American soil, while British officials were attempting to arrest an American man on British soil after he destroyed British property. At this point, William S. Harney, the United States general in charge of the Department of Oregon, heard of the story and ran as fast as he could to the San Juan Islands. Harney had a reputation for being unable to be ordered around and hated being told what to do. And during the Mexican-American War, he was court-martialed 4 times for disobeying orders. With the opportunity to redeem himself and achieve personal glory, he wanted to take control of the situation, get a win for the Americans, and fully redeem himself. With this, he immediately started to attempt to incite a war to claim the San Juan Islands for the United States. In order to do this, he had the George Pickett, who's now infamous for Pickett's charge from the Battle of Gettysburg in the later American Civil War, and sent him to the San Juan Islands to set up a military camp on the island. Plus, on top of having a military camp, he placed a sign down that said only American laws applied to the San Juan Islands. Research, I found a bunch of primary sources of the pig war and found this news story from the St. Cloud Democrat, a newspaper from Minnesota. Although newspapers at the time didn't call it the pig war, they called it the San Juan Island occupation, the British in San Juan, and a couple other names in that area. Anyways, an article published gives a glimpse of what the public thought of Harney. Quote, America and the UK got along peaceably together until later when, for not some well-explained reason, General Harney, in command of the American troops on that coast, ordered Captain Pickett with his company to take military possession of the island and exercise exclusive jurisdiction over it. At this point, to my knowledge, the British vacated the island and instead went to Vancouver Island with James Douglas. Douglas was originally the Hudson's Bay, or Canada, chief factor at Fort Vancouver, Washington, and was forced to relocate to Fort Victoria because of American settlers in 1858 during a gold rush, which brought Lyman Cutler to San Juan. After he was moved to Vancouver Island, he became the governor and thought that the San Juan Islands were undeniably British. In fact, back in 1853, he was the one who sent Charles Griffin, the sheep farmer and pig owner, to San Juan Island to start his sheep farm. Douglas himself hated Americans because they had already pushed him out of Washington into Vancouver Island, and he didn't want to be moved again. At this point, Douglas saw Pickett's camp of American soldiers across the bay and ordered that the British would also set up camp on San Juan Island. But if he did this, the Americans vowed that they would open fire. Douglas ordered Royal Navy officer Captain Jeffrey Hornby to send troops to San Juan Island, but Hornby refused Douglas's orders, which kept the conflict from breaking out into an all-out war. The leading British admiral in the region, Rear Admiral Baines, who outranked Douglas, heard of the situation and headed over to San Juan. Once he heard the full context of the situation, he was stunned at the utter lunacy of having such an intense conflict over the shooting of a pig. Right then, he canceled all of Douglas's orders and staved off British forces and instead pursued peace. From here, Baines enforced a small ceasefire and made it so everybody would all hang out until word of the conflict got back to London and Washington, D.C. Once word got back, both the American and British governments were shocked by what was going on, how a single pig could start such a baffling conflict. The General Winfield Scott, who at the time was the commanding general of the entire U.S. Army, a veteran of the Mexico-American War, and was known for negotiating in past border disputes with Britain, was sent to San Juan Islands. In fact, only a few years earlier, funnily enough, during the Mexico-American War, A handful of years later, funnily enough, during the American Civil War, Scott led the charge at Gettysburg and, to make a long story short, helped the Union win one of the pivotal battles in the Civil War, even repelling Pickett's charge in the process. The funny thing is that Winfield Scott had already dealt with Harney's insubordination during the Mexico-American War. Due to this and the ridiculousness of the situation, Scott took a strong disliking to Harney and his policy of attempting to incite a war to grab a handful of relatively meaningless islands in the Pacific Northwest. Scott went to San Juan Island to mediate, according to the New York Herald, which oddly enough loved the Pig War and published over a dozen news stories, said in September 1859, quote, "In an English map now before us we perceive they are claimed as British property. This is nothing new. We have seen such things before. As far as we can fairly judge from the documents before us, our claim is a rightful one and will be insisted on. General Scott is no doubt fortified with the proper evidence and will be able to make a correct deduction of the title." End quote. Once Scott arrived, both sides gave conflicting reports of where the pig was, when it was shot, and the context around it. At this point, Scott reprimanded just about everybody except for the British, who were fairly level-headed and never overreacted to the Americans' actions. In fact, if the British hadn't acted so calmly, there wouldn't have been an all-out war. At this point, Scott reprimanded everyone except for the British, who were fairly level-headed and never overreacted to the Americans' actions. In fact, if the British hadn't acted so calmly, there would have already been an all-out war by now. Scott ended up cutting a deal with Britain where a joint military operation would take place until the U.S. and British governments could decide what to do with the islands. As part of the agreement, Pickett was not allowed back on the island, and after telling Harney this, Scott left and went back to the east where the American Civil War was beginning to show its signs of beginning. Harney was left in charge and, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the joint operation was a farce and sent Pickett back to the island. Harney was still recklessly calling for war and attempting to incite it by writing a letter to the British saying that the U.S. troops did not recognize the agreement and that San Juan was theirs. Harney was still threatening war and was finally removed from San Juan by Winfield Scott. From there, the joint operations went ahead and things were relatively peaceful. The two sides got along great and celebrated national holidays together. The British troops celebrated the 4th of July and American troops celebrated the King's birthday. The Pig War had finally militarily concluded in October 1859. At this point, the lands were still disputed, but the conflict was pushed aside due to the American Civil War breaking out in 1861. The issue was that during the American Civil War, the British began to show support for the Confederacy. Due to this, relations between Britain and the U.S. soured. After the War finally militarily concluded in October 1859. At this point, the lands were still disputed, but the conflict was pushed aside due to the American Civil War breaking out in 1861. The issue was that during the American Civil War, the British began to show support for the Confederacy. Due to this, relations between British and the U.S. soured. After the Civil War concluded, there were several gripes still held between them. Eventually, the conflict over the San Juan Islands was sent to international arbitration. The Germans were trusted to end the border dispute of the San Juan Islands in 1872, well over 13 years after the conflict had militarily ended, and in the end, Emperor Wilhelm I decided that the San Juan Islands would go to the Americans. Shortly thereafter, on the 25th of November, 1873, the last British troops left the San Juan Islands. The Pig War finally concluded with 0 casualties, with only a single pig, owned by Charles Griffin, dying a martyr. And with that, thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about squabbles in the American West with me, Megan, and Chloe. And until next time, this has been The Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College.